Good morning, ESL 5. Today is Monday, June 1st, and we are reading number 61, Jim Crow and the Great Migration. Read and annotate the article, then complete the ELA writing and quiz. Today we are going to read at level 780. Jim Crow and the Great Migration. So already we know we're going to learn about two things, or the connection between these things. So it's very important that you remember this issue of Jim Crow. We'll also learn about this and read about it tomorrow. And we're talking about the migration of black people going from the south to the north. Because remember, the majority of black people during the Civil War and Reconstruction were in the South because they had been slaves in the South, and slavery was not as common in the North. So, but today we see there are a lot of black people in places like New York City and other big cities like Chicago. So there was a period of time in history that black people moved to these areas. So we're going to learn about that today. In 1881, Booker T. Washington became the head of the Tuskegee Institute in Alabama. The school educated African Americans to be teachers, farmers, and ministers. In September 1895, Washington gave a speech at the Atlanta Cotton States Exposition. He asked white business owners to hire Southern African Americans. Washington promised that blacks would be peaceful workers. They would not make trouble asking for more civil rights. He promised that whites and blacks would be kept separate socially. Washington hoped that blacks would be allowed some freedom to find a good job. He believed other civil rights could come later. Other black leaders, like W.E.B. Du Bois, was from Harvard University. He did not agree with Washington. They wanted full civil rights now. So here we are learning about the beginning of segregation in the United States and how some black people allowed and were okay with there being division and segregation separate socially, right? And other people said, no, we need full rights, equality now. So there was a debate in the beginning. We see this is in the late 1800s. Free, but to do what? In the 30 years after the Civil War, African Americans' lives changed. They were not slaves anymore. But what freedoms could they have? Could they buy or sell homes and land? Who could get married? Who could own firearms? That means guns. Vote, get a job, receive an education, or travel freely? For a little more than 10 years during Reconstruction, after the Civil War, African Americans could do many of these things. But when the Northern armies left in 1877, everything changed. These were the years when white Southerners returned to power. Redemption meant controlling black bodies and black minds. Much of this control came from Jim Crow laws. These were town, city, and state laws that demanded that whites and blacks must be segregated. Let's look at that again. What is a Jim Crow law? Here are we describing the law. So Jim Crow is kind of an adjective in this sense, even though it's originally a name. It's an adjective describing the type of law. What do these laws do? They are city, town, state laws that require blacks and whites to be segregated, which means separated. Then came Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896. When you see two names like this with a V in the middle, it usually means a court case, an important court case, especially if it comes with a date. In this case, the Supreme Court said that separate was equal. Segregation was allowed. It would take 58 years for the Supreme Court to change its mind. In 1954, the court said that separate was not equal in the Brown versus Board of Education decision. But for 58 years, African Americans had to educate themselves and learn how to protest. During this time, blacks began to move from the fields in the South to the cities in the North. This was called the Great Migration. Quickly, just to review, Supreme Court, that is the highest court, that's the federal court covering the entire country. Every state has its own courts, but the federal court decides laws for the entire country. Remember, states can still have different laws from each other, but if the Supreme Court makes a law, that's the law for all of the states. Moving on up. The first black migration occurred between 1905 and 1930. The much larger Great Migration was between the 1940s and early 1950s. So we see there's two periods of time when there's migrations happening. The reasons for the Great Migrations were many. Southern blacks could not vote or hold political jobs anymore. Finding work was more difficult. Housing and education was poor. That means bad. Mobs of whites took the law into their own hands. They punished black people. African Americans could no longer protect their families. There were many other reasons for moving north. Sharecropping, working for white farm owners, kept black families in debt. It was a dead end. Also, a type of beetle destroyed the cotton crops. So, blacks lost their jobs. At the same time, there were many jobs in northern factories. Blacks heard there was better housing, the right to vote, and high-paying jobs in the north. Friends and family returned for visits or wrote letters about a better life up north. The Chicago Defender, the major black newspaper, was read in most southern black homes, and it told stories about northern jobs. Between 1910 and 1920, the black population in New York, Chicago, and Detroit more than doubled. Working in northern cities. Many African Americans ended up in northern cities, but many others moved north more slowly. Some left southern farms and moved to nearby southern cities. Others found themselves working in Kentucky coal fields. Many would stay for a few months and then return home. Still, others were brought north by labor agents. These people worked for owners of northern factories. The agents made money bringing blacks north, but many of these jobs were bad, so blacks left and went back to the South. Black migrants enjoyed more freedom in the North, but life was not easy. Jobs were hard to keep. Places to live were very crowded. Apartment buildings built for 5 families were filled with 30 families. Often blacks were hired because white workers were on strike and refusing to work until they got better pay. Eventually the strikes ended. Whites went back to work and blacks lost their jobs. This led to violence too. In East St. Louis, striking white laborers attacked black workers who took their jobs. Police did nothing. More than 50 people died in the violence. City violence. There was now a lot more violence against African Americans. Much of this came from the Ku Klux Klan. Remember? KKK. It became popular again because of a movie released in 1915 called The Birth of a Nation, which showed blacks as fools, fat servant women, or as dangerous. It gave credit to the Klan for saving whites after the Civil War. It was shown at the White House. President Woodrow Wilson admired the film. The National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, NAACP, called it 3 miles of filth. There was a race riot in East St. Louis in 1917, where many blacks were killed. The NAACP organized a silent march in New York City. 10,000 men, women, and children marched from Harlem to the heart of Manhattan. 2 years later, black neighborhoods would come under attack in Chicago. the governor called in the Illinois National Guard. Almost 40 people died, and over 5,000 were injured, and over 1,000 African Americans lost their homes in the 5 days of violence. More than 25 cities had race riots in the summer of 1919. Black way of life. Migrating north, African Americans brought their art and way of life too. African American religion, music, storytelling, and the arts became popular. Harlem and New York City became famous for its music, art, and literature. In the first 20 years of the 1900s, Booker T. Washington's ideas about patiently waiting for civil rights changed. The NAACP, started by Du Bois, challenged the laws that made blacks second-class citizens. Marcus Garvey, founder and leader of the Universal Negro Improvement Association, UNIA, pushed for a return to Africa to start a new black man's empire. These groups gave their members pride and a feeling of belonging. Moving put on hold. The stock market crashed in 1929 and millions of jobs were lost. The northern migration slowed, but the reasons to move north were still there. People waited until the Second Great Migration began in the 1940s and continued into the 1950s, as gains were made in civil rights. All of this was the result of the First Great Migration that began in the early 1900s. All right, so today's lesson is particularly interesting and important because it helps us to understand some of where, what we're seeing in the news right now about protests in big cities all across the country because of the death of a man by a police officer. So we're going to talk more about that soon, but we need to understand the history of how we got there in the first place, and understanding the segregation and the discrimination in the United States after the Civil War and after abolition will help us to understand what's going on right now. So let's move over to our activities. We have a writing and quiz. Do not do the social studies. ELA writing and quiz. What is our writing today? Why did many African Americans migrate north in the early 1900s? Was life better for Black people in the North after Reconstruction? How did violence affect Black communities? Explain and use details from the article. Write in your own words. I expect that you're going to answer all of the questions completely and with detail and evidence from the article. If you have any questions, send me a message on Remind.